Talking about the subject of terraforming the planet Mars. And that's kind of an esoteric subject. In case you're not familiar with the term, terraforming means applying global engineering procedures in order to modify the existing climate of a planet toward a climate that is more similar to Earth. Now, my own scientific background is in the area of physiological ecology and interested in physiological ecology of microorganisms and plants. So I am interested specifically in the biological aspects of terraforming. Before I get to that, I have to at least discuss a couple of assumptions that you make when you consider terraforming a planetary body. One of the basic assumptions is, with regard to Mars, is that we assume there is no native life presently extant on Mars. If we subsequently find that there are native life on Mars, of some form, microbial or otherwise, then that puts terraforming plants on an indefinite hold basis. Secondly, we assume that the people who will be doing the terraforming procedure will be permanent residents of Mars, because those are the people who are most interested in doing it. That implies, therefore, that we have to first get to Mars, we have to spend time doing exploration, we have to establish self-sufficient bases, and those bases have got to grow up to the status of full-fledged colonies on Mars. And to have a sufficient population and a sufficient industrial base that they can devote a small part of their industrial activity toward the long-term goal of altering the climate of the planet around them. The third assumption is that I'm only going to be talking about the part of terraforming that involves establishing a microbial biosphere on Mars, and secondly, a plant habitable biosphere around Mars. Because if we talk about the establishment of a biosphere on Mars in which human beings and animals can walk around unaided on the open surface of Mars, we're talking about a period of time to get to that step that is so long that it's probably many thousands of years into the future. On the other hand, talking about microbial ecosystems and plant ecosystems, putting them on Mars, that falls into the category of a time span that we could accomplish within a reasonable number of years. That is on the number of hundreds of years to 1,000 years. Okay. Before I start discussing biological aspects of terraforming, I'm going to briefly go over some of the pertinent parameters about Mars' present climate with you. Here's a few of Mars' physical parameters. Average distance from the Sun is about 1.52 times as far as that from the Earth. That means that Mars receives about 43% as much sunlight at its surface as the Earth does. That translates into an amount of radiation which we can measure as 860 micromolar quanta. The amount that normally strikes the surface of the Earth under full sunshine is about 2,000 micromolar quanta. It turns out, for the purpose of terraforming Mars, this value is not a problem. Most photosynthetic microorganisms, cyanobacteria, algae, and so forth, find that they can get along very well indeed with far less than that. Many plants, such as mosses, can get along very well with less than 860 micromolar quanta, and even many flowering plants, including agricultural crops, can do quite well and hit their maximum photosynthesis at a level like that, or even slightly lower. Okay. In addition, Mars' surface gravity is roughly 0.38. That of Earth, so 100 pounds on Earth weighs 38 pounds on Mars. We don't have data for growing plants at 0.38 gravity, but what little data we do have from orbital studies suggests that a relatively small amount of gravity is sufficient to orient plants. So this seems to be an all right parameter. The day length on Mars, as Bob Zuckerman just told you a while ago, is 24.6 hours. That works out very favorably for putting plants on Mars. If it was several times that value, say 48 hours or 96 hours, plants would have a severe problem adjusting their biological cycles. Also, the obliquity of the planet Mars, that is how much its axis is tilted, is roughly the same as that of Earth. So Mars has seasons all going to implant ecosystems on Mars because plants take cues from changing day lengths and changing temperatures in order to regulate the stages in their life cycle. If they don't see the correct day length at a certain time, they won't flower and set seeds. Those parameters seem to be quite optimal, like rotation and axial tilt, for terraforming Mars. There's one parameter that isn't up there, so I have to mention that just briefly. The level of incident UV radiation strikes Mars. It's a very high value. It's ultra high value that it is essentially legal for most organisms. The next two parameters are quite important for terraforming Mars. Temperature and the atmospheric pressure. Mars is cold. Its average temperature is minus 60 degrees centigrade compared to an average surface temperature for Earth of 15 degrees centigrade.
Use the mic, please.
Okay. And the total atmospheric pressure on Mars. On Earth, it's over 1,000 millibars of pressure, mostly nitrogen and oxygen. On Mars, however, your total atmospheric pressure is at a maximum of about 10 millibars, and as an average, about 6 to 7 millibars. That is such a low pressure atmosphere that liquid water is not stable. Water, in fact, acts like dry ice does on Earth, and it exists either as a gas or an ice, but not as a liquid. And that is a critical factor for organism survival, because they need liquid water. How cold is Mars? It helps to make a comparison. If we go to one of the harshest climatic environments on Earth, Antarctica and the dry valleys of Antarctica, we get the curves shown here in this slide. This is its daily maximum temperature and the daily minimum temperature at a place called Vanda Station in the dry valleys. You can see down there that it rarely gets up above freezing, but that the temperature range between the max and min temperatures in a typical day of month is fairly small. It stays cold when it's cold. It stays, if you want to call that warm, a little bit warm when it's warm. Contrast that to the temperature range of the Viking 2 lander. Once in a while, the temperature gets up to about the level that you would find at Vanda Station, but it plunges, and the lows are very, very low. And that kind of a range of temperature change can be very hard on any kind of organism, microbial or otherwise. Mars is small, as this slide makes quite clear. But its total surface area, since it doesn't have any oceans, is actually about equal to the total land surface area of the Earth. So we've got a lot of space to work with on Mars. We'll just throw a couple of tourist shots up here. Mars has a lot of interesting geology, as you know. It has a number of extremely high volcanoes shown here in this shot. And it has an extremely large canyon system called Valles Marineris. This shot has become so popular that it is practically a tourist shot. You can imagine this on a postcard someday being sent home to Aunt Edith. Wish you were here having a wonderful time. This is Olympus Mons, an enormous volcano. And of course, you're probably familiar with this shot, Valles Marineris, one of the biggest canyon systems in the solar system. It's over 3,000 miles long, runs around 400 miles wide, and from 4 to 7 miles deep. For example, you can take our entire Grand Canyon and drop it into one of these little crevices there. Grand Canyon is pretty small by comparison. These, however, are not the features that are most interesting to us when we're considering terraforming. This kind of feature is, however, this spidery-looking region that you see here, a whole bunch of dried-out dendritic-like channels, is exactly similar to the river systems and tributaries of a terrestrial river system. We think this indicates that at one time in the past, there was significant rainfall on Mars. Precipitation may very well have formed this river system on Mars. It's not the only interesting features. If we look back inside the canyons of Valles Marineris, we find mesas of sediments in the canyon like this. These mesas are now thought to be, by people like Stephen Squires at Cornell, the remains of sediments laid down in lakes. The canyons of Valles Marineris are thought to have once been very large Great Lakes and existed for quite a period of time, long enough to get all these sediments in there. This is an outflow channel system. It looks exactly like what it looks like. It is a dried up set of riverbeds, and at one time in the past these carried away catastrophic floods with enormous flow rates and enormous velocities, carrying huge volumes of water down from the highlands to the lowlands in the northern hemisphere. Down in the bottoms of some of these outflow channels, you get streamlined, eroded islands like this, where the tail points here mark the downstream direction of the flowing water. The water flowed long enough to erode those islands out. Where did the water go finally? It had to go somewhere. This, in fact, is further down that canyon system, which is Mangalavelis. This is the point where it dropped off the highlands of the southern hemisphere into the lowlands of the northern hemisphere. And people have analyzed these shots, and they believe they can see the remains of what may very well have been the shorelines of an ancient ocean. In fact, Baker and his colleagues down in Texas refer to this as Oceanus Borealis, a global-wide boreal ocean. Okay, that's Mars as we think it may once have been. Where did the water go? If the water was all there and flowing on the surface in these incredible amounts, then certain things must have been true about Mars in the past. It must have had a much thicker atmosphere than it has at present. And it must have been much warmer than it is at present. Where did all of that atmosphere and all of that ice go? If it was lost out in outer space, we have nothing to talk about, because it's all gone away, and therefore we have no raw materials left with which we could possibly terraform Mars. Fortunately, for my talk this evening, it did not go away. In fact, it's all sitting there still, and it's frozen, and it's mixed up into the regolith, or surface material, of Mars. Let's take the example of the water, because it's easiest to examine. We know the water is still there because we can see a lot of it. This is the South Polar ice cap, the permanent South Polar ice cap. It's about 219 miles in diameter, and represents a fairly large reservoir of water. It's only one of two, of course. Here's the North and the South Polar ice cap shown together for comparison. The North Polar cap is more than 600 miles in diameter. Obviously, the depth of the water ice at both these caps varies considerably from place to place across the poles. But we know that in places it is quite thick. If you look at this shot, which shows ice cliffs from the North Pole, you can look along some of these points, and you can certainly get the feeling that you are looking at a very high cliff, possibly as high as 1 kilometer or more. So there is a lot of ice at the North Pole and South Pole. Let's see if we can make an inventory of just how much water may be present on Mars, the raw material for terraforming. If we were to imagine smoothing out the entire planet Mars till it's like a billiard ball, and melting all of the ice that's locked up in the North and South Polar ice caps, we could spread that water over the entire globe of the planet, and we would have a depth of water equal to 1 meter over the whole globe. That's a pretty good amount of water, just from that one source, and we can see that source. There's another source, right around the poles, on both poles. There's an area called layered terrain. It's alternating layers of ice and dust, so it looks banded from orbit. That area contains a lot of ice also, and we think it contains 3 meters globally of water in addition. The next one, polar ice lenses. These are huge areas of permafrost located under and in the regolith way down towards the equator. And I'll show you what those may look like in just a moment. Clay minerals and megaregolith, kind of grab those together. This is the soil that is bound up in the water that is bound up in various minerals and in the overall regolith, which may be as deep as 1 kilometer or so around the surface. That amount of water is thought to hold an additional 13 meters of water globally. Deep water is deep ground ice and groundwater. Those two estimates up there are no more than guesstimates of this huge reservoir, but we know it's there. And it must at least represent hundreds of more meters of water available. I'll show you how we know some of these things. This is an example of the cross-section of the Martian regolith from pole to pole. The ice lenses are these purple areas that you can see here. Here's the south and north permanent poles. Those ice lenses are just areas of permafrost, very much like the areas of permafrost that you would find in Antarctica or in the Arctic of Canada and Russia. And they contain enormous quantities of water. As you get closer towards the poles down here, they begin to peter out as the temperature of Mars rises and makes them unstable, so that you lose the moisture there. So there's another major reservoir of water. Water associated with the general minerals, atmosphere, and regolith. We know that's there because we can see it. Orbital shots show, and on certain times of the day on Mars, you can see fog building up in the craters. This is water fog. And for brief periods, you can have foggy weather in craters on Mars. As for deep water, nature has provided excavators to give us evidence of this. When meteorites or comets crash into the surface of Mars, they penetrate the surface. If one were to crash into the moon, you would get a very clean, sharp-cut crater. And all of the material that is normally ejected by the explosion would fly out in what's called ballistic trajectories. Not so on Mars. When the object strikes Mars, if it goes deep enough, it hits either ground ice or ground water. That water gets incorporated into the dust and rock of the regolith, and it blows it out as mud slurry. That causes all the formation of these blow-like patterns. This is very much like throwing a rock into a large vat of mud. And the craters, in fact, are called splosh craters by the geologists. Okay, this gets us to the point where we can look at what we've got to work with on Mars for purposes of terraforming. That is, the volatile inventory. We've talked about water in depth because that's a little easier to deal with because we can show it to you. We also have various estimates for nitrogen and CO2. They vary quite a bit depending upon the assumptions that are made by different people when they make the estimates. If the lower end estimates are correct, it will be difficult indeed to terraform Mars because we simply will not have enough raw materials to easily work with it. If the middle or upper end estimates are correct, then terraforming could proceed in a relatively straightforward manner. So if we assume the middle estimates are correct, that we have adequate supplies of carbon dioxide to rebuild an atmosphere, that there's an adequate supply of nitrogen there, evidently, or a future for nitrogen cycling, and plenty of water, we can proceed to consider how we would actually do terraforming. We go back to the slide and look at two of our key parameters, temperature and atmospheric pressure. The two are interrelated. Mars is cold in part because it has a very thin atmosphere, and therefore the atmosphere cannot hold heat into the planet at all. It also has a very thin atmosphere because it is cold, and therefore the CO2 that largely composes the atmosphere tends to fall out as CO2 ice, keeping the atmosphere very, very thin. So how do we get out of that conundrum? The answer seems to be fairly straightforward. Turn on the heat. If we warm up this thermometer of Mars, begin to get it out of that terrible cold of the glacial age that's locked up the atmosphere of the water, we can begin to get the system of Mars rebuilt. How do we turn up the heat? There's the key trick. There's been several good proposals for how to do that. One of the earliest comes from James Oberg in his book called New Earth, back in the 1970s. He proposed that we use large orbiting solar mirrors to reflect additional sunlight down on the surface of Mars and therefore raise the average surface temperature. That might look something like this. I'm assuming in this illustration, which was created by Candace Elliott, my co-author on the Mars calendar, for sale, that the mirrors in orbit are roughly 1,400 kilometers in diameter, more or less designed out of reflective mylar and built something like an umbrella. And they are reflecting large amounts of light then down onto the surface of the planet Mars, raising the total solar insolation to the planet. There are other proposals, though. A number of years ago, James Lovelock and Michael Allenby wrote a book called The Greening of Mars, in which they proposed shooting rockets to Mars filled with greenhouse gases in order to trap the heat around Mars and raise its temperature. Now, that original idea was refined by Chris McKay, Owen Toon, and James Casting to produce greenhouse gases directly on the surface of Mars from minerals that are in the regolith. That's what this slide is intended to represent, a factory that produces greenhouse gases. The greenhouse gases, in turn, will trap additional heat in the atmosphere, raising the temperature of Mars. This is one of their diagrams that actually comes from Martin Fogg's book on terraforming, and it shows how, if you choose the appropriate cocktail mix of fluorocarbons, that you can close the heat window that radiates back from Mars and keep the heat around Mars. Incidentally, the ones they're considering, like C2F6, CF4, F6, these have been shown to be ozone friendly. They will not degrade ozone. Zubrin and McKay, in an article in the book called Islands in the Sky, proposed a synergistic approach to accomplish this. They would take solar mirrors and greenhouse gases, operating them both simultaneously, and use them to terraform Mars. And you can see in the bar here, as your temperature of Mars is slowly risen by the fact that not only are you putting more energy into the surface of Mars, but you're keeping it there too because you're producing greenhouse gases at the same time. Your volatiles begin to go out from the regolith into the atmosphere. The atmospheric pressure, shown here by the black bars, starts rising higher and higher levels. Once you get it a little bit higher, liquid water becomes stable on the surface. And finally, when you get it up warm enough, you can start introducing microorganisms. They can start transforming the atmosphere. The atmosphere that would come out of this particular process would presumably largely be CO2 with small amounts of nitrogen and, of course, water vapor. Now we can finally start talking about the biological aspects of terraforming. What would terraforming be like? How would it proceed and in what order? Now, this diagram actually comes from a basic biology book, Introduction to Botany. And it reflects the well-known fact that if you were to take a walk down from the top of a mountain, say in the tropics, you would pass through a series of biotic communities, from the very harsh, cold top of that mountain, through an area of alpine tundra, into an area of taiga, which is tundra mixed with boreal forest, down into a temperate forest as you move down lower in elevation, and of course if you're at the tropics you can move all the way down to a tropical forest. The same thing happens if you simply take a walk from the poles of a planet, of our planet, and take a walk all the way down into the tropics to the equator. You go through the same sequence of biological communities, each one adapted to a progressively less harsh environment. I propose that the process of terraforming Mars biologically would follow precisely this scheme. So you can think of Mars, terraforming Mars, as walking Mars down a high mountain, moving through a series of plant communities. This analogy gives you some guidance as to where you should look for the organisms to carry out your terraforming, because it tells you what order that you need to work with and what communities on Earth you you would need to go with first. Where would you go first? Well, we go to the place on Earth where we can find organisms that can endure the harshest climate of all. So we go to the South Pole. We go to Antarctica. Now, this shot, in fact, is from the peninsula, the Arctic Peninsula. It's a little too warm for us, a little too benign a climate. It actually gets up above freezing during the austral summer. In fact, the people that work there like to refer to this as the banana belt. So we have to go to some place that's even worse than this. And that's the Antarctic dry valleys. These places are truly harsh indeed. They are like the last place on Earth where you can find life of any kind, and that life is microbial. The area of snow and ice that you see down there in the center, that is the top of a lake. The lake is permanently frozen by permanent cold weather. The depth of that ice could be anywhere from 4 to 6 meters thick. If you somehow manage to cut your way down through that, or melt your way through, you find some truly bizarre things down in the bottom. You find mats of blue-green algae, or cyanobacteria, bacteria, certain kinds of protozoa, other kinds of primitive organisms. It looks very much like something from the primitive Earth. That's not harsh enough for us. Let's look at the land around the dry valleys. This looks like the very definition of barrenness, but that's deceptive, because there are, in fact, a wide range of organisms present in and on, around, and under the surface of these rocks. They look like this. Many of these things are called cyanobacteria, blue-green algae, the old name for them. Some of them are also green algae, or chlorophytes. They live in rocks, under rocks, in the cracks of rocks. They're called cryptoendolithic, meaning hiding inside rocks. These guys are the toughest things we've got on Earth. And they are likely to be the first things that we're going to put on Mars. If we do get lakes reformed on Mars, we get the climate benign enough, the temperature up enough that we restore the hydrological cycle, it's likely that we'll be able to introduce some of the microorganisms from the Antarctic lakes into lakes on Mars, suggested in this shot, which is an outtake from the calendar. If we want to get organisms up on the surfaces of rocks where they're less protected, we have to do one other thing in the way of terraforming. That specifically is we've got to give the planet an ozone shield against ultraviolet radiation. Martin Fogg has estimated that if we can generate about 2 millibars of oxygen in the atmosphere of Mars, it will give us an effective UV shield, and it will allow us to spread a diversity of microorganisms across the planet. So if we generate that by some kind of activity, such as heating carbonates and nitrates up to about 1,000 degrees centigrade on a large scale, we can drive off nitrogen and oxygen gas and create an ozone shield. That allows life to start spreading across Mars at a much faster pace. So the first garden of Mars, as in the title of my talk, will be a microbial garden. The second garden of Mars is quite important, and it will consist of organisms such as shown here. This is Antarctic moss. Moss is not a subject that gets studied very much, not even in botany, not even by botanists. But if and when people get around to doing terraforming on Mars, mosses are going to be very important indeed. Because the crucial next step to turning Mars into more like Earth will be to get widespread areas like Canadian Arctic tundra, like this. Why is that important? Because mosses can do a number of really interesting things, especially if they form peatlands. Mosses seem to be able to photosynthesize very well at low light levels. They can photosynthesize very well at low temperatures. It's a pretty valuable asset if you're going to be on Mars. They also seem to be able to tolerate very high levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is exactly what we believe will be the initial atmosphere of a terraformed Mars in its early stages. They also don't seem to need an awful lot of oxygen in order to carry out their photosynthesis. Perhaps as little as 2 or 3% compared to the 21% that's on Earth now. And they also have some other features. You can dry a moss out completely and leave it around for months, wet it, and it resumes metabolism right away. That also could be very useful on Mars. And also, mosses generate things called peat, which has uses far beyond just throwing them in your garden around your strawberries. Peat also piles up and removes CO2 from the atmosphere while the mosses are pumping oxygen out. So if we can establish a widespread peatlands on Mars, we can transform the atmosphere from primarily CO2 to one with more oxygen in it. Now, Martin Fogg has estimated that if we established about 50% cover of the surface of Mars with peatlands, it would take about 700 years to get enough oxygen in the atmosphere that we could go on to put the next biological communities in place. I cannot tell from his book on terraforming exactly how he got that figure, but I do know that if you assume that the rate of photosynthesis that mosses use now is typical, they are very, very slow in terms of producing oxygen. But if you pump up the CO2 around them, then they start going gangbusters. So it's possible that 700-year estimate could be as low as 150 years. At any rate, if we can get peatlands and mosses established on Mars, the first place might be in the bottoms of canyon lands where we have the most favorable environments and plenty of water. Thereafter, what we need to do is to get at least 20 millibars of oxygen present in the Martian atmosphere. That, the limited amount of data on plant physiology suggests, is the minimum amount of oxygen we have to get plants to work in respiration. If we get that, we can now proceed to the next stage, or the third stage, in the gardens of Mars. And that involves bringing in flowering plants. Now, a word about this. In some of the books that have been intended for popular consumption about terraforming, such as Arthur Clarke's Snows of Olympus, the Lovelock and Allaby book, and so forth, the assumption is presented that if Mars is terraformed, it will be a totally green planet. There will be no color whatsoever. This is based on the assumption that because oxygen will be low, we will not have insect pollinators. If we do not have insect pollinators, the assumption goes, we cannot have bright, showy flowers. And to those statements, I say, dandelions. Dandelions are big and showy and bright. And boy, are they a nuisance in our lawns. We all are familiar with them. And they do something, they do all this without sex. They don't need pollinators at all. They are what we call in botany apomictic, or asexual if you prefer. And they are very, very fertile. And apomixis, or asexual reproduction in plants, is not an uncommon phenomenon. It is very, very common, for instance, in the family to which dandelions belong. By the way, these are Arctic dandelions from Alaska, not your usual garden variety dandelion. They are also apomictic. Plants have a lot of ways of reproducing without using animal pollinators. They can do so by vegetative propagation. This thing focused. Vegetative propagation, sending out runners and rhizomes. Example, you're all familiar with this crabgrass. That's how it makes itself really annoying, sending out all those runners. You can have obligate apomictic plants that produce seeds asexually, like dandelions. There's lots of them. You can have facultative apomictic plants that sometimes can go sexual and sometimes can go apomictic. You can also have plants that are primarily self-fertilizing. They fertilize themselves. They don't need insect pollinators at all. And you may also have partially self- and cross-fertilizing plants. So they can be, kind of get the best of both worlds. And finally, you can get wind-pollinated plants, things like pine trees. They don't need insect pollinators either. In fact, the only thing in the plant kingdom that you can't take to Mars in the early stages of terraforming will be obligately insect and bird-pollinated plants. Everything else you can, and that represents a vast array of plants to choose from. For instance, it turns out that up in Arctic regions, a lot of the flowering plants are self-fertilizing or apomictic, asexual, such as this one, Arctic poppy. Now, this bizarre thing, which looks like it belongs on another world, it's Sagittaria flagellaris, or the spider saxifrage. It sends out these runners, which look like legs, with which it manages to crawl across the surface, more or less establishing new plants, and it also has self-pollinating little yellow flowers on it. There's this plant, which is actually a sedge, and it's wind-pollinated. It's called cotton grass. It forms enormous stands up in Alaska, so it's quite a hardy plant, and even quite attractive looking here. As you can see here, this is from the Brooks Range of Alaska, a large meadow in the Arctic. Other plants. These things have the unfortunate name of being called louse worts. Fortunately, they're actually quite attractive. What you're seeing here are the plants, and they're surrounded by white fuzz, which acts as an insulator. They have essentially their own overcoats. It'd be a very useful feature to take to Mars also. When they reproduce, and put out flowers, they're less color, so they're quite attractive. We get the oxygen level of the Martian atmosphere up to 20 millibars or better, we can start having a very diverse tundra ecosystem with flowering plants coming into profusion. Might look something like this. And we can also open the way up for the next stage, which is to begin putting forests on Mars. The initial forests will consist of taiga, which is primarily made up of firs and spruces up in the Canadian north. It looks like this from the air. The taiga land is down the south part of the slide, lower part of the slide, and the tundra land is up in the north part of the slide. That taiga land consists mostly of wind-pollinated conifers like spruces and firs. You'll have an understory of lichens, mosses, ferns, and a variety of flowering plants, like some of the ones I already showed you, including cranberries, which don't need insect pollinators either, so we can have cranberry jelly with whatever we want to pass for turkey on Thanksgiving on Mars. What's the last stage? The fourth garden for the planet Mars. It's the temperate forest zone. You may not think of the temperate forest zone as a place where you don't need insect pollinators, but by and large, and surprisingly, many of the tree species that dominate your temperate forest lands are wind-pollinated. In fact, this is just a sampling of the genera of wind-pollinated plants that you find in a temperate forest. All these genera, together with the common names shown here, are wind-pollinated, and they represent over 240 species of trees that we could all presumably take to Mars one day for terraforming. That's a lot of pool of species to begin selecting candidates from. Other things besides trees. This thing is so common you probably wouldn't even look at it. It's called hawkweed. It's a weed. You find it in vacant lots all the time. It's apomictic or asexual. Make a good candidate for Mars. Comes in a variety of colors, all the way to orange to red. Lots of other little plants that you find in the understory in your temperate forests, like this one, wild ginger, self-fertilizing. The final reason for setting up a temperate zone somewhere around the equator of Mars will be this one. At that level, you can now have agriculture on the open surface of Mars. Most of our food comes from cereal grains in the world. Cereal grains are grasses, they're wind-pollinated. We don't need insect pollinators for them. What about a varied diet? Well, there's a lot of other plants that have been developed in the agricultural industry, like tomatoes, which are self-pollinated. Some potatoes, beans, lettuce, raspberries and strawberries, quite a variety of things. Once you've got agriculture on the open surface, we've got more than just a colony with limited to greenhouses. We've got a self-sustaining planet. Closing remark. We're about to approach the turn of the millennium. Very close, coming up. And it would be nice to have some kind of a thing to look forward to in the new millennium that's a little more positive than the TV show Millennium, in which the world is going to be haunted by demons. Man. I'd like to propose that a good goal for humanity for the future would be to devote a large part of that next millennium going out, explore Mars, set up some bases, eventually let them grow into colonies, and eventually those colonies might terraform Mars. And it's possible that by the end of the next millennium in 3000, Mars could look like that instead. A land of water, vegetation, air. Thanks. Starting to death. Got a question? Sure.
Genetic engineering means creating plants that speed up the earth.
Yes. And that, in fact, yes, and that is an assumption that's actually made in books by Carl Sagan and other people who've written books for popular consumption. They don't usually carry it much further than saying, yes, we could use genetic engineering. Because at the present time, it's difficult to define what it is we want to genetically engineer, specifically to make plants work better on Mars. My own work suggests that there's several things we could do. One would be to allow plants to tolerate low oxygen levels. Would be one possibility. The other one might be to instill nitrogen fixation into plants, if nitrogen might be in short supply on terraforming Mars. Those two things are presently beyond our capability for genetic engineering, but will certainly be capable within probably the next couple of decades at most, because there's a major push in agri-research to be able to engineer nitrogen fixation into all kinds of plants where it isn't normally found. Yeah?
What kind of problems or benefits would come from the type of iron-rich soil that there is and lack of fertilizer?
Well, we're not sure there is lack of fertilizer at this point. One of the things we really don't know about Mars is, well, we know that there's about 0.3 millibar of nitrogen in the atmosphere. What we don't know and have never measured is how much nitrogen might be in the regolith. None of the machines that have been sent to Mars previously or even planned in the immediate present or future will measure nitrogen in this regolith. And that becomes a crucial factor. It is suspected by people like Chris McKay, who studied this problem in detail, that what may have happened is Mars may once have had quite a bit of nitrogen in its original atmosphere, and that over time, without biological recycling developing, most of that dinitrogen gas would be converted into nitrates and drop down into the regolith. That suggests that if we had a 1 to 2% content in the regolith of nitrogen as nitrate nitrogen, which is basically fertilizer, that we would have a very adequate supply of nitrogen in the first place. It would just be a question of getting it back into the biological cycle through reduction of nitrates and ammonification.
Just like they are going to kick us out in 4 minutes so they can sit up for the space-time theater tonight. So about 4 minutes of questions, then everyone needs to move.
Go ahead.
Isn't there iron in the regolith?
Yes.
Hard to get that out.
Same way you would anywhere else. Mining procedures. If you want to remove it.
But you probably have to remove it before you plant.
I'm not sure that you necessarily need to remove it. Yeah.
Okay, there's still no good answer about how all the former atmosphere, regulated water, which we've seen had good indication was indeed there, has gotten in its present form.
No.
There is some thought, I was reading something, what the magnetosphere of Mars seems to be quite the solar wind is carrying away quite a bit of material there, ionic material.
Well, that is one idea that has been kicked around, but also some estimates have been made as to how much of certain elements Mars might have lost through solar wind and so forth, erosion processes like that. One estimate I found said that at most Mars might have lost 1 meter globally of water. Compared to what else is still there, that's not terribly much. Now we can't say for sure that it didn't lose more relatively of nitrogen or something else at this point. The real area of unknown is we don't have really solid estimates of Mars volatile inventories, and that's something we need to get for the future.
Okay, now, as I understand what the there's been difficulty in getting it with the kind of experiments we can run robotically, at least with present technology or morbid technology. I mean, you brought up a lot of things that we need to know. Okay. Now, is it the case that like 20 years ago when they were sending some landers, they just didn't have these questions? Could they?
Well, the detectors that were sent to Mars were not capable of picking up low atomic number volatils. They could only pick up the higher numbers. So when they tell you the composition of the Martian regolith, they're leaving out anything with carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and sodium. We couldn't measure it. And as far as I know, there isn't a plan to change that, at least within the foreseeable future.
You had a question?
I want to find out on that cotton camping, does that have a long enough fiber that it can be spun in the yarn?
I honestly don't know. It's actually it's a sedge, but it's possible. Yeah.
Would the low gravity cause you to revert back into your frozen state if you lose the atmosphere, or would having the plants there prevent that?
Well, if we're capable of driving the system towards an Earth-like environment, I think we can hold it there.
And definitely you wouldn't have to import.
I would not expect us to have to import a lot of all of those. The one possibility is if it proves that we don't have as much nitrogen locked up in the regolith as nitrates as some people hope is there at the present time. I'll say as they hope is there. We might have to import nitrogen in some unknown quantity from elsewhere. It could be readily obtained by a civilization 200 years from now, certainly from the atmosphere of Jupiter or something like that.
But there's no indication that the low gravity would mess up the ecology of the plant life. You wouldn't have to use the warp train.
No, there is an assumption made in some of the popular literature that somehow you would suddenly get pine trees 6 miles tall or something like that. That's extremely unlikely. If the relationship between gravity and plant height was sort of reciprocal, then you might expect a third of the gravity to produce a pine tree 3 times taller than it would normally be. 300-foot tall pine tree would be pretty impressive. On the other hand, research done in zero-G of space suggests that plants under low gravity produce less of the wall structural materials like cellulose and lignin than they do under full Earth gravity, and that would mean that they might not be any taller on Mars than they are on Earth, because they wouldn't have the structural strength to get up that high.
Okay, we are really out of time. Any more questions?